All right, welcome to this deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're plunging into some really interesting source material. It's all about nattokinase.
Hmm.
That's an enzyme, right? From fermented soybeans. And there are some, well, pretty intriguing claims about its health effects.
Yeah, especially for, heart health, metabolic health too.
Exactly. And the source we're mainly drawing from today is it's presented as a kind of mini lecture by a biomedical scientist,
Yeah.
a professor who really knows his stuff on metabolic health.
Right. And he actually started off by taking a moment to thank everyone tuning in and welcoming new listeners. It felt, like joining a class
Yeah,
almost.
a nice touch, and we wanted to echo that. So, seriously, thank you all for listening. We really appreciate you spending your time with us.
Absolutely.
And hey, if you find this useful or just interesting, maybe share it. It really does help us get this information out to more people.
It really does. And if you're new, welcome. Glad to have you.
Definitely. So our mission today, our goal for this deep dive is pretty clear. Let's unpack these nattokinase claims, look at the actual evidence presented in the source, and try to figure out what it might mean for, well, for you.
Sounds good. So let's start right at the beginning. What is nattokinase?
Okay, so the source says it's an enzyme from natto.
Exactly. Natto, that traditional Japanese food, fermented soybeans, been eaten there for, centuries.
Right. And there's a kind of observation, isn't there? Lower heart disease rates in places where people eat a lot of natto.
Precisely. Which naturally leads you to wonder, okay, what's in the natto that might be contributing? And nattokinase is a prime candidate. It's actually produced by a specific bacterium, Bacillus subtilis, during that fermentation process.
So you can just eat natto
Yeah.
if you can get past the reputation.
Right.
Sticky and pungent.
Yeah, the source definitely mentions that. It says it's sticky and very pungent. So maybe not for everyone's taste buds.
Okay.
But the good news is it's also pretty widely available now as a supplement. They extract the enzyme.
Right, right. And what about typical doses? Did the source mention that for supplements?
It did. Around 100 to 200 milligrams a day was mentioned. Or, more often, you see it measured in FUs.
FUs. Okay. Refresh my memory. What's FU?
Fibrinolytic units. It's basically a measure of how active the enzyme is, specifically its ability to break down fibrin.
Ah, fibrin. Okay. Not something else.
No, definitely not. And the typical range mentioned there was 2,000 to 4,000 FUs per day.
Got it. 2,000 to 4,000 FUs.
Okay.
So nattokinase. It's really famous for one thing above all, right? Breaking down blood clots. Is that the main story?
That's definitely its primary claim to fame, yeah. That's where it usually pops up in health discussions. To really get it, though, you kind of need to understand how clots form.
Okay. Quick primer.
Yeah, so think of fibrin. It's a protein, but it acts like scaffolding, like a mesh of sticky threads. When you get injured, your body makes this fibrin mesh to basically build a clot, trap blood cells, stop the bleeding.
Which is essential, obviously. You need that for healing.
Totally vital, life-saving even. The problem comes when clots form where they shouldn't, inside blood vessels, or they just stick around too long. That can block blood flow, leading to, heart attack, stroke, serious stuff.
And that's where nattokinase supposedly steps in.
Exactly, because
Yeah.
it seems to interact directly with that fibrin mesh.
How? Does it just chew it up?
Pretty much. It can break down fibrin directly, sort of snipping those protein strands, holding the clot together. But maybe even more importantly, according to the source material, it also seems to boost our body's own natural systems for dissolving clots.
Okay, interesting. Boosting our own system. How does that work?
Well, the main way seems to be by activating an enzyme called tissue plasminogen activator. You might hear it called TPA.
PPA, yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that used medically sometimes for strokes?
That's the one. Its job is to convert plasminogen, which is inactive, into its active form, which is called plasmin.
And plasmin is
Right.
the scissors you mentioned.
Exactly. Plasmin is the key enzyme that does the cutting. It chops up the fibrin mesh, dissolving the clot, thinning the blood effectively. So nattokinase seems to do both, attack fibrin directly and ramp up your body's plasmin production.
And the source seemed to suggest this might have an advantage over some standard blood thinners.
It did mention that, yeah. The point was that while drugs like, say, warfarin are crucial for preventing clots, they can carry a significant risk of bleeding complications.
Right.
The idea presented is that nattokinase might help dissolve clots or prevent them from forming excessively, but potentially without that same high risk of major bleeding. A sort of gentler approach, maybe.
That would be a pretty big deal, wouldn't it, if the evidence supports it?
So speaking of evidence, what studies did the source point to for this clot-busting action?
Yeah, there were some quite compelling ones mentioned. One from 2015 in Scientific Reports. It looked at just a single dose of
A
nattokinase.
single dose. And they saw effects quickly. Very quickly. Within hours, actually. They used a dose of 2,000 FUs in healthy people. And the way they measured it was by looking at D-dimer levels in the blood.
Okay, D-dimer. What exactly is that telling us? Why is that important?
D-dimer is basically a little protein fragment. It gets released when plasmin, the scissors, starts breaking down a fibrin clot.
Ah, so it's like the debris from the clot breakdown.
Exactly. So if you see D-dimer levels go up, it's a direct sign that clot breakdown is actively happening. And seeing that happen within hours of taking nattokinase, that suggests a pretty rapid effect.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite direct. What about longer-term effects? Did they see changes in clotting factors over time?
Yes, another study was mentioned from 2008. This one used a slightly higher dose, 4,000 FUs daily, but they gave it for 8 weeks to healthy adults.
Okay, 8 weeks. What happened?
They found about a 9% reduction in fibrinogen levels.
Fibrinogen. That's the precursor, right? The stuff that makes fibrin.
Precisely. So lower fibrinogen means less raw material floating around to form new clots in the first place.
So over time, that would presumably lower your overall clotting risk.
That's the logical conclusion, yeah. The source described these findings as very real benefits at pretty normal doses. So pretty solid backing for that clot management idea.
Okay, that makes sense for the clot side of things. But the source material went further, suggesting broader benefits for cardiovascular health, sort of beyond just the clots themselves.
It did, yeah. It moved into talking about potential effects on atherosclerosis.
Plaque buildup in the arteries.
Right, the underlying cause of so much heart disease. So anything impacting plaque is, well, it's significant. The source highlighted some human studies that actually looked at plaque reduction,
Really? Human studies showing plaque reduction. Where?
particularly in the carotid arteries, the ones in your neck. They're easier to measure and often reflect what's going on elsewhere, like in the heart.
Okay, tell me about the first big one mentioned.
Right, this was a 2022 study, Frontiers in Cardiovascular Medicine. Pretty large, over 1,000 patients. And these were people who already had confirmed plaque in their carotid arteries.
Wow, okay. 1,000 people with existing plaque. How long did they follow them?
For over a year, 12 months plus. And the group taking nattokinase, they were on a fairly high dose, just over 10,000 FUs a day.
10,000 FUs.
They saw a significant reduction in the size of that plaque compared to the placebo group.
Wait, reduction. Not just slowing down, but shrinking.
A reduction, yeah. And they also looked at something called intima media thickness, IMT.
IMT. That's the thickness of the artery wall lining.
Exactly. It's measured with ultrasound. Thicker walls, stiffer arteries. That's a sign of atherosclerosis progressing. And in this study, they saw a reduction in IMT too, alongside the plaque shrinking. It suggests potentially a reversal or at least a significant slowing of the disease process.
That's pretty impressive. Did that study look at lipids too, cholesterol and triglycerides?
It did, and found improvements there as well. Lower LDL, the, quote, bad cholesterol, lower triglycerides, and even a little bump up in HDL, the good cholesterol. And the source specifically highlighted the improvement in the triglyceride to HDL ratio.
Yeah.
Apparently, that ratio is seen as a really strong predictor of heart disease risk in a lot of research.
So hitting multiple markers, LDL, triglycerides, HDL, and the plaque itself. That's quite comprehensive. What about the second study on atherosclerosis the source mentioned?
This one was smaller, about 80 patients, also looking at carotid plaque. But what made it really interesting was the comparison group.
Oh, who were they comparing it to?
They had a nattokinase group, a control group, and a group taking simvastatin, a common statin drug.
Ah, okay. A head-to-head with a pharmaceutical? Over how long?
6 months for this one. And the results were, well, quite eye-opening.
Don't leave me hanging.
The nattokinase group saw a 37% reduction in carotid plaque size.
37%. Wow. How did the statin group do?
The simvastatin group saw about a 25% reduction in the same time frame.
So nattokinase actually outperformed the statin in reducing plaque size in this specific study.
In the study, yes. And they also saw that same pattern, again, lower triglycerides, higher HDL in the nattokinase group.
Okay, that really drives home the source's comment about it potentially rivaling or even outperforming pharmaceuticals, maybe with fewer side effects. Did the source offer any thoughts on why that might happen or any caveats?
It didn't dive super deep into the why it might outperform in this instance, but acknowledged it was a provocative finding. Of course, you always have to be careful comparing single studies, different populations, designs, etc.
Sure.
but it definitely makes you think. One limitation the source did point out for both of these plaque studies, though, was that they focused on the carotid arteries. They didn't measure calcified plaque in the coronary arteries, the heart arteries themselves, which you typically check with something like a CAC scan.
Right, okay. Good context. So these are significant results for plaque and lipids. How might nattokinase actually be working to achieve this beyond the clot busting? What mechanisms did the source explore, especially for the lipid changes?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? Given how consistently the studies show lower triglycerides, that seems like a major clue.
Right.
While the exact human mechanisms are still being worked out, the source pointed to animal and cell studies suggesting a couple of possibilities. One is boosting the activity of lipoprotein lipase, LPL.
LPL. That's the enzyme that helps clear triglycerides out of the bloodstream, right?
Yeah.
Pulls them into tissues.
That's the one. So more LPL activity means your body gets better at clearing those triglycerides. Another possibility mentioned is activating hormone-sensitive lipase, or HSL.
HSL. What does that do?
That one helps break down triglycerides that are already stored in your fat cells.
Ah, so potentially affecting both circulating and stored fats.
Potentially, yeah. Though the source was careful to note the human data on that direct fat cell effect is less solid than the blood lipid changes. There was also mention of potentially inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase.
Hang on, HMG-CoA reductase. Isn't that the enzyme that statins target to lower cholesterol production?
Exactly the same one, which is interesting, right? Because the source noted nattokinase seemed to outperform the statin in that one plaque study.
Yeah.
Yet its direct effect on this statin target enzyme in humans isn't as strongly confirmed as maybe the LPL-HSL links. It suggests nattokinase might be working through several different pathways, not just the main one we associate with statins.
Okay, so better triglyceride clearance seems likely. Maybe some effect on cholesterol synthesis, but perhaps other things are going on too. The source also mentioned lipid peroxidation. What's that about?
Yeah, this is really important for heart health. Lipid peroxidation is basically when fats get damaged by oxidation. Think of it like fats going rancid, especially the fats carried in LDL particles.
Oxidized LDL.
Exactly. And the source emphasized that oxidized LDL seems to be a much stronger predictor of heart disease risk than just your standard LDL number in many analyses.
Why is oxidized LDL so bad for arteries?
Because it's really attractive to immune cells, specifically macrophages. They basically gobble up this oxidized LDL. They transform into these big, bloated inflammatory cells called foam cells. And these foam cells are major culprits in building up atherosclerotic plaque.
Okay, so if nattokinase could reduce that initial oxidation of LDL,
it could potentially limit the formation of those inflammatory foam cells and slow down plaque development. That's the theory.
is there evidence for that?
The source mentioned rodent studies where natto extracts were shown to reduce lipid peroxidation.
Rodents, okay. So not quite human proof yet for the supplement form.
Right. Need more human studies to confirm that specific effect with nattokinase supplements, but it offers a very plausible mechanism for how it might improve the lipid situation and reduce plaque, potentially easing those cardiometabolic complications, as the source put it.
It does tie things together nicely. Now, the source also kind of hinted at broader metabolic health effects, maybe fat cells, insulin sensitivity. How solid was that part?
Yeah, that was definitely framed as more early days. The human evidence there is much less robust than for the cardiovascular side. There was mention of one human study from 2020. It found that nattokinase seemed to reduce fasting insulin and glucose levels, but it was specifically in a group of women who had obesity and diabetes.
Interesting. One study hinting at blood sugar or insulin benefits?
Right. But the source stressed it was pretty much the only human study they found looking directly at those metabolic outcomes. There's also some animal work again, often using natto extract, not the pure enzyme that showed things like reduced fat cell size and less lipid buildup in obese rodents.
Which might connect back to that HSL enzyme breaking down stored fat.
Could be, yeah. That's a potential link. But the overall message from the source was clear. While there are some hints, the primary strength of the evidence for nattokinase right now, definitely the cardiovascular health.
Got it. Cardiovascular focus is key. So we've got strong evidence for clots, good support for arterial health, lipids, plaque. What about the downsides? Limitations? Safety issues mentioned in the source.
Yeah, important to cover those. A few limitations were brought up, like Some early studies used the whole natto food, not just the enzyme supplement. So it's hard to perfectly isolate nattokinase's effect from everything else in the natto.
Makes sense.
Also, while human trials exist, they're often relatively small, maybe shorter duration compared to giant drug trials. And as we saw, the doses used can vary quite a lot between studies from 2,000 FUs up to that 10,000 FU level.
Right. Makes finding the perfect dose tricky.
Exactly. And there was that quite recent bioavailability concern mentioned a 2025 paper suggesting maybe only about a quarter of the enzyme's activity actually survives digestion.
Whoa, okay. So the label might say 4,000 FUs, but you might only effectively get 1,000.
That's the potential issue raised, yeah. It really highlights that the quality, maybe the formulation of the supplement could matter quite a bit for whether you get the results seen in the studies.
Something to keep in mind. What about safety, straight up?
Generally considered pretty good, according to the source. Animal studies didn't find toxicity even at really high doses, but
There's always a but.
there's the big one, the crucial one. Because it works on blood clotting, there is a risk of bleeding or finding it harder to stop bleeding if you get cut.
Okay, that's the main safety flag.
Absolutely. And the source was really emphatic about this. If you are taking any kind of blood-thinning medication, anticoagulants like warfarin, antiplatelets like aspirin or clopidogrel, or even blood pressure meds, you absolutely must talk to your doctor or clinician before even thinking about trying nattokinase.
Non-negotiable, basically. Need that medical advice.
Totally. They need to weigh the risks and potential interactions for your specific situation.
Understood. Okay, so let's try and wrap this deep dive up. Pulling together everything from the source material, what are the key takeaways? What are the practical suggestions?
Well, the big picture is that nattokinase looks like a really fascinating enzyme. There's solid evidence for its ability to help break down clots and quite compelling support for broader heart health benefits, improving lipids, especially triglycerides, maybe reducing plaque.
And potentially through mechanisms like reducing that harmful oxidized LDL.
Exactly. The source really framed it as a potential natural ally for your vascular wellness and health.
It does sound like it, based on what was presented. So, practically speaking, what did the source suggest?
One suggestion was, hey, if you're game, maybe try the original source first. Eat whole food natto if you can handle the unique taste and texture.
Brief chuckle. The pungent, sticky stuff.
Right. You get the nattokinase naturally, plus potentially other beneficial things in the fermented soy.
Okay. And if natto's not happening, or you want a specific dose?
Then look at supplements. And the source pointed back to those typical doses, 100, 200 milligrams, or maybe more commonly, 2,000 to 4,000 FUs a day. That seems like a reasonable starting point based on much of the research, even though higher doses were used in some studies.
And repeating the crucial safety point.
Absolutely bears repeating. Check with your clinician first, especially if you're on other medications, particularly blood thinners or blood pressure drugs.
Got it. This has been really informative. It's kind of amazing, isn't it, how these compounds found in traditional foods, eaten for ages, are now being explored by science and showing these potentially powerful effects.
It really is. And it highlights that delicate balance in our bodies, doesn't it? Like clotting, essential for healing, but dangerous if it goes wrong. These natural compounds might offer ways to help support that healthy balance.
A really interesting area. So to leave our listeners with that final thought from the source material we explored today, remember, more knowledge, better health.
Well said. And just as a final note, if this topic of metabolic health is something you want to dive deeper into, the source did mention checking out insulinic.com for things like courses or coaching, or benbickman.com for more insider content and Q&As related to the professor's work.
Excellent resources to point people towards. Thanks so much for walking us through all that.
My pleasure. Fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. And thanks again to everyone for tuning into this deep dive.